Okay, so verse 6 ties the examples that follow this verse with the analogy that we just looked at, and that's the application, and as we're going to see here in a minute, and the warning against idolatry. Idolatry is the issue here throughout this. Paul is going to give us 4 examples of events from Israel's history. And what I wanted you to think about is, are they 4 different examples of why most didn't enter the promised land? Or are they 4 different Israelite attitudes that are mirrored in the Corinthians? I mean, if you were teaching this lesson, you could just, if you were preaching a lesson about you could just pick this, and this as examples of God's judgment on his people without having any correlation to anything. Or you could pick 4 examples of that have a direct application to what he's talking to the Corinthians about now. And I choose that. That's what Paul is doing here. Both Israel and Corinth are in danger. Well, Israel did, and Corinth is in danger of losing their spiritual privileges. They had spiritual privileges. Baptism and the Lord's Supper. Most of Israel fell. Most of them. Paul's thinking, what about you Corinthians? Is it going to be most of you too? Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Okay, Roger.
I'm thinking we're talking about the aging of the people, even Moses at his death. In Deuteronomy 32, or 34:2, or 7, Moses was 120 years old when he died. When he died, his eyes were undimmed and his vigor was unabated.
Right.
So he was even able to function.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he looked like he was 80.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, he kept him too.
Right. So question 6, which is the one I've just been chomping at the bit to go through here, is what specific lessons were the Corinthians to learn? Now, in verse 6a that we just read, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. So they're written for us. We're going to get into this that part of it, a lot more detail than when we get to verse 11, because he's going to repeat that same phrase again. But in verse 6, the latter part of verse 6, he says that we might not desire evil as they did. So verse 6b is kind of the preamble to the 4 examples that he's going to give, the basis for the existence of those examples. Israel had a desire for evil. They lusted after evil things. How many of you, if you were able to talk to an Israelite at the time and ask him, is what you're doing evil, what would they have said? No. They did. It's not like they would have characterized them as evil. And listen, a lot of times when we're living our lives, we don't stop and characterize the things that we're doing that are wrong as being evil. It's either something we want to do at the time, or that we really want to do it, and so we don't even think about the circumstance. But it's clear that in God's view, the things that they were desiring was evil. And so don't desire evil is at the bottom of this whole thing right here. Again, towards the Corinthians. And the specific examples now start in verse 7 with letter B. I think I had kind of included 6b as an example, a specific lesson. And as I'm looking at that, it's not really an example. It's the basis for it. So what was the first lesson he told them?
Idolatry. Don't get into that.
Don't be as some of them were. Don't be idolaters as some of them were. This is not just an injunction or an advice. You might think twice about that idolatry thing. He's being specific here, and Paul's specific example is in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 6. Let's go over there. Now, and I mentioned this last week, who makes up most of the church in Corinth? Gentiles or Jews? Gentiles. But they knew these stories. They knew this book. He doesn't have to say, by the way, turn over your scroll to Exodus 32 and verse 6, and let's read together what that says. The idolatry occurred in the first part of verse 6. They rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. Okay, that's where we would think that would end. That's where we're reading. But what part of this verse did Paul quote? The second part. And that is, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So he quoted the second part. The first part talks about the fact, verse 31, they made a god, they made a calf. And then they offered sacrifices to it. And in our minds, that's the idolatry. You make an idol and then you worship it. But that's not what Paul said. Don't be idolaters like they were. And then he doesn't mention make an idol. He doesn't mention worship the idol. He brings up the second part, and that is that they specifically did what? No, before that. They ate and drank. What's the issue in Corinth right now? What are the Corinthians wanting to do? Eat meat, sacrifice idols. Where? In the idol temple. Okay? He's already mentioned that in chapter 8 and verse 10 of 1 Corinthians. I wish I had 7 Bibles up here, so I would have to be going back and forth. On my computer, I got 2 screens, and I can look at them at the same time. So in chapter 8 and verse 10, he says, "For anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat foods offered to idols?" Because that's what they were doing. He's going to bring it up again. I'm not going to take you there because it's in the same text in 1 Corinthians 10, but it's starting in verse 14 and going down through verse 22, where he's just absolutely going to say, no. He's kind of been skirting around that issue, but then he's going to say, you cannot do that anymore. Idolatry here, in Paul's mind, and the application from Exodus, is seen in eating a cultic meal in the presence of an idol and in worship to that idol. Which is exactly what some of the Corinthians are wanting to do. In fact, how are they characterizing that? How are they characterizing eating that meat in that sacrificed idols? It's a non-issue. Is there really an idol there? No, the idols aren't gods. And what about meat? Does meat make you better or less in God's eyes? No. See how they're working that? It's not really an idol there, and the meat doesn't matter. And they're trying to say that this is something that God doesn't care about, that this is a non-issue with God. Exodus chapter 32 and verse 28 tells us, "And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and that day about 3,000 men of the people died." What is Paul's number in 1 Corinthians 10? Huh? I thought he did. Okay, he doesn't give a specific number there? I'm going to take one of my extra pieces of paper here and use it for a marker. Okay, 23,000, that's the next one. So he doesn't say how many there were in that case. All right. So, but 3,000 died here. Does that sound like it's a non-issue with God? That it's a thing he doesn't care about, that 3,000 of these people died as a result of that? Okay, plus you have a subsequent plague in verse 35. Lord sent a plague among the people because they'd made the calf that Aaron made. And I have no idea how many died in that. But again, it doesn't sound like God was indifferent. But then it's also added, what else does Paul add? Besides the fact, and Mike gave us the answer, they ate and they drank, and what else they do? They rose up to play. Now, that doesn't mean fun and games and frolicking. That they played hide and seek or captured the flag, they had a big picnic there. This has overtones of sexual play. In fact, all of the rabbis in early commentaries, as they're written on this, it talks about it. It's sexual in nature. In Exodus chapter 32, still there, verse 25. I'd like to hear it from some of you, other translations. Mine says, when Moses saw the people had broken loose. What do other translations have?
Out of control.
Out of control. Anybody else have something different than that? Unbridled. They're running wild. They're running wild and uncontrolled. And again, understood by rabbis and even the early church as being sexual in nature, which leads us to the next example in verse 8, which is don't commit sexual immorality. Okay, so it flows very nicely from the rising up to play and having the meal in the presence and then playing afterwards. But this first one in verse 7 is the first example of these bodies being strewn in the wilderness. Okay, verse 8. My handy marker here. We must not indulge in sexual immorality. Some of your translations have I like it better, says fornication, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. And that also has a connection to the Corinthians, because remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, what do we have? A man who has his father's wife. Chapter 5, verses 10 through 11, we have people who are continuing fellowship with people that commit sexual immorality. And then in chapter 6, verses 9 through 20, we talked about the fact that people were saying, the use of temple prostitutes shouldn't be an issue. And again, I'll just remind you, going to a sexual prostitute was like you going to McDonald's for a hamburger. I mean, that was just so much a part of their culture, it didn't even think twice about it. So, that which also makes me wonder, and I'm pretty confident, that if I'm eating a meal in an idol temple, like the Corinthians were doing, what else is probably involved in that? Probably some sort of sexual relationship with the men or women that are there. So the reference here is Numbers chapter 25. Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 9. And this is the Baal worship at Peor. This is when the daughters of Moab came in and they tried to they tempted the people into sacrificing to their gods. They ate. Isn't that interesting? Verse 2 it says they invited the people to the sacrifices of God, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. You see a pattern here that's happening every time there's idol worship. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against him. So eating and bowing down, again, it seems that idolatry and sexual immorality kind of go together, and they go together at meals, where meals are eaten in worship to idol gods. Now, Paul didn't cite the passage, but he mentions the judgment. Paul says 23,000. Numbers here says 24,000. You find that number. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. Now, if you go over to chapter 26 of Numbers, and it talks about the number of priests is 23,000. I don't know if there's an error, that a copyist made a mistake or somebody corrected it. It's 23. It's 24, not 23. There's no satisfactory explanation I can give to you for why those numbers are different. But I'll tell you what, it wasn't corrected. Whatever that copyist saw, when he saw Paul said 23, they left it there, and they left it there, and they left it there. Because you don't change, you don't get to edit as a copyist, a scribe. You don't get to edit the number to make it right. And so that's just another, to me, an indication that even when there's a misquotation, if Paul wrote 23,000 and it was in his error that he made, nobody changed it. Nobody went through and put a little red mark. Oh, Paul, sorry, you can get an A- on this because it's not that many. So there's the second lesson. Don't indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And then the result of that was, again, 24,000 bodies being strewn in the wilderness. Verse 9, back in 1 Corinthians 10. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. So we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did. Go back over to Numbers chapter 21 this time. Yes?
I was going to add, I don't know if for verse 9 or verse 10, I haven't found them yet, if there's like as explicit a command as, like you mentioned, for verse 7, you've got later, flee from idolatry.
Right. Right.
For
Right.
verse 8, there is flee immorality in 6 verse 8. So
Right.
he is not beating around the bush here.
Right.
He's clear about this.
Right. Right. Yes?
In Exodus 32:25, when you were talking about it saying broken loose,
Yeah?
in the King James Version it says naked.
Said what?
Naked.
Naked? Okay. That's interesting. Completely out of control. You know? I hadn't noticed that. So very good. So in Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 through 7, they set out to go to the Red Sea. The people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? No food, no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many people died. The people came to Moses, we've sinned, etc., etc. So they spoke against the manna, they spoke against God, they spoke against Moses. That they're having to eat that manna instead of ordinary food. They don't like the spiritual food that God's providing for them, the miraculous food. And again, you see this in the situation in Corinth. The word test does not appear here in Numbers, but when the same incident is quoted or referred to in Psalm 78 and verse 18. Somebody brought up Psalm 78 when we were talking about the examples where, here it is again. Psalm 78, verse 18, they tested God in their hearts by demanding the food they craved. And Paul here is warning them that challenging his prohibition here against eating meat sacrificed to idols in the temples is putting Christ to the test. You're testing him. And again, some texts here have testing Christ. Mine does, putting Christ to the test. And some manuscripts have Lord. And I'm not sure why some would have Christus and others would have Kyrios. But apparently that's the case. And the best scholarship says Christ is to be preferred. I'll just give you that. So it is Christ who they are testing when they try to eat these meals sacrificed to idols in the temple and at the same time trying to eat the Lord's Supper that he's going to talk about in verses 14 through 22. But again, what's the main activity that's talked about here? It's food and eating. All right, verse 10. We'll be able to finish this. This is the fourth and final example. And the lesson here is don't grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Don't grumble as they did and were destroyed by the destroyer. There's two possible Old Testament examples of this. The first one is Numbers chapter 14. and verses 28 and 29, which we just looked at a moment ago, because they were grumbling against God. We need to get a leader and take us back to Egypt and all of that. And we found out there that from Numbers 1 that we looked at a minute ago, that 603,548 died. The other one is 2 chapters later in Numbers, in chapter 16. And this is where Korah and his crew grumble against Moses as God's agent. Verse 3 says, they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, you've gone too far, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? In that case, if you go down to verse 35, at first, we have 250 that are consumed by fire from God. And then the people complained again the next day in verse 41. The next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses, against Aaron. You have killed the people of the Lord. And so then a plague breaks out from the Lord to them. And in verse 49, 14,700 people die. So that equals 950 people that died in that particular case from 1 Corinthians, where people grumbled. Now, as I was going through this and studying it, it seems that most people believe that the grumbling here that Paul is referring to, some of them grumbled, as some did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Neither passage, neither the one in Numbers 14 or here in Numbers 16, does it mention a destroyer. But it seems more like there's a destroyer because fire's coming out from heaven, and then there's a plague that's coming. But you take 14,000 and you take however many other thousand and some other thousand, and it's hard to get most of them out of the 603,550. Personally, I'm leaning towards the one in Numbers 14. It didn't happen all at once, but they all died. And it doesn't appear like they would have died normally. Their time was set. You're going to die, all of you, all 603,448 of you are going to die during this 40-year period. Your women aren't. Your children aren't. The older men aren't. They'll probably die naturally. The younger men aren't. You are. And I think that whether it's one or the other doesn't really matter to me, because they both match what Paul is saying about the Corinthians, grumbling at him because he had previously told them, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be eating this food, the sacrificed idols, going to these idol feasts. And then in this letter, telling them, because their answer in chapter 8, food doesn't matter, food's for the stomach, stomach's for food, and food doesn't matter, idols don't matter. That's from their letter in response to his letter that we don't have, or one of the letters that we don't have. So he brought it up then. And they're grumbling right now. They're mad. They're angry. They want to continue go to those feasts. They want to continue eating that meat in those temples. So much so, they're trying to get weak members to go with them. We can fix you. We can make you strong. And listen, I don't know how many times I've read all of these examples. I never once applied it to the Corinthians themselves, specifically looking at idolatry, at sexual immorality, and the idolatry being mainly seen in their eating. The eating the meat that had been sacrificed to idols as a part of their idolatry, an important part of their idolatry. And yet that's what we see here, yes.
And he already, like we talked about last week, perhaps surprisingly, tied their identity with the Israelites, because he said, for our fathers.
Right.
Like, he's already tied them to the Israelites,
Right.
and now even more in a way that's not like, oh yeah, they are my fathers. And then it's like,
Right.
That is not necessarily a good thing.
Right? And their whole relationship. How did both of their relationships begin with God? Baptism. And what were they privileged to partake of? The spiritual food that God provided for them, just like the Lord's Supper. Yes.
But it also, Paul is convicting them slowly. He wants to hit their heart.
Oh, yeah.
Hit their heart first about you're hurting your brother.
Right.
Now he's going to make these connections of saying, okay, maybe we've gotten his heart a little soft here. You know, that I put that jab in. Now we're going to start making a case for why it's sinful in
Right.
of itself.
Well, and you look at that. He hit them with regards to their brothers. You're destroying your brothers by doing this. Then he kind of hits them and saying, listen, your prize isn't guaranteed. You can lose. Just like these athletes who train and then they may not get the prize. They can be disqualified. You can be disqualified. And then he brings up these examples from the past where they have an example. And though the Israelites were baptized to God, though they were given the spiritual food, did it keep them from committing idolatry? No. And Paul's saying, you either. Let the one who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Yes, John?
Well, and he brought himself into the mix. He said, this could happen to me. And if you don't think it could happen to me, look at what Israel had.
Right.
They still tried.
Right, right. Yeah.
This is maybe too big of a question, but
Oh, I love those.
just in terms of like the whole Corinthian letter, Paul has authority as an apostle and he's inspired, and so I understand those two things. But I guess I just wonder, is that the authority that Paul is using to write this type of a letter with? Because I know that for myself, like, you know, there's a lot of things that would caution me against writing to my brother or sister in Christ something like this. You know, the plank in your own eye, take heed, like anyone who thinks you stand, take heed, but like it's right there, the exact same type of a thing, and like, you know, following the proper procedure when a brother wrongs you and those
Right.
types of things. But I don't know, just in a big scheme of things, is Paul's authority as an apostle and by inspiration the reason he can do this kind
Yes,
of thing?
yes,
So,
yes. In fact, if you go over to the 14th chapter, verse 37, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are the command of the Lord. So, I mean, he brings it up again towards the end. Part of the issue here is, from our view, he's an apostle. Why aren't you listening to him? They're questioning his apostleship. That's what he's having to fight for that too. If you were a real apostle, you'd accept money from us. You demand that we pay you, and you're not. He had to go through a whole argumentation about that. So they kind of have